Hello, and welcome to the third lecture on the Atlantic Slavery and Abolition module. This week, we're going to be building on the foundation of what we were talking about last week in terms of the origins of colonial empires and how that shaped colonial thought, which in turn inspired the attitudes towards slavery in this time period. And this week, we're going to be looking at 18th century Atlantic slavery, which is really when the big numbers started of people being started transported across the Atlantic. And we're going to kind of take a 2 week approach with this. This week, we'll be looking at the macro level changes to countries and colonial empires. Next week, we'll be looking at the micro stories of individual slaves who were transported across the three legs of the Atlantic triangular trade route. So this week, we'll be looking kind of expanding outside of the Atlantic Ocean and seeing how events that happened there changed events globally. So, what I need to do at first is establish that when I talk about the Atlantic system, it's widely agreed that there are actually two periods of the Atlantic system that take place. The first Atlantic system is kind of what we've already covered, and it's dominated by Spain and Portugal and their colonization of Central and South America. That is what is known as the first colonial system. And it's actually, in terms of numbers of slaves transported, it is much smaller than the second Atlantic system, which I'll go on and discuss in more detail in a minute. And the first Atlantic slave system, the reason slaves are initially traded in such high numbers, much higher numbers than we'd seen in the regional slave trades of Africa we were discussing last time, the reason why such high numbers of slaves start taking place in this time period is because of disease. Europeans transmit diseases in Mexico specifically and most notably, but also in South America, in Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru. And the disease that Europeans bring to Central and South America decimates the population. If you look at the graph that I've included on this slide, at the bottom you have the years, and at the side you have the population in millions. Now, at the start of the 1500s, population of Mexico is just under 22 million. And if you can see between 1550 and 1600, that gets as low as below 2 million. And the reason for this is unintentional biological warfare. It is not simply the Spanish and Portuguese killing locals, although that did happen. These numbers are down to one, smallpox, which rips through Latin American population. There's also a mysterious hemorrhaging disease that appears. So people just start profusely bleeding from all their orifices. And people are not entirely sure even now what this was, but it was potent and swept through much of Central America. And another really important factor to consider is the sexual violence that was committed by Europeans when they got to the supposed New World. And syphilis proves deadly in most cases, but also diseases such viral diseases such as herpes, which in Europeans only has localized rashes, could actually prove to be fatal in the population of Mexico, where there was just not the same levels of antibodies. So, because of this, the encomienda system, the way in which Spanish and Portuguese settlers set up their colonies, that was proving to fail because they didn't have the labor force to mine for resources. So what the Spanish did, was increasingly go to the West African countries who had proved very readily available to trade people that they'd taken from Central Africa. So as time continues, the Spanish start ramping up the numbers of slaves from Africa to replace the dying and diminishing population in Latin America. Now, this changes the Atlantic system, and by the 18th century, two new superpowers emerge, and that is Britain and France. They see the success of using an African workforce. And there are a number of reasons why historians think this might be possible. Generally speaking, in terms of physiology, people from Central and West Africa are generally taller, more athletic, and fitter than the natives who were in the areas of Central America in this time period. They could move greater amounts of food, they could work longer. So they proved to be an incredibly powerful and efficient workforce. And the British and the French decide that they are also going to start going to West Africa more frequently and purchasing more slaves to move to their new colonies. Now, compared to the first Atlantic system, the second one is dominated by the French and the British, and it's more in North America than South America. You look at the map on the bottom right hand side of your screen, the green territory is where Britain and France were ruling over in this time period. So large parts of North America and Canada. And the French and the British fought for control of these areas and moved millions of slaves to the Caribbean to fund and help organize these new systems. And you can see a drastic transformation that happens in the 18th century when compared to the previous century. In the 17th century, Britain had first started to establish quite small colonies in North America. The most famous, one of the first, is John Smith, um, establishes the Virginia Company and settles in Jamestown as early as 1607. And generally speaking, British travelers to North America in this time period are Puritans, religious fanatics who believed that Europe, that England and lots of parts of Europe weren't religious enough. So these small pockets of intensely religious Christians are scattered across the east coast of America in this time period. And also, Britain conquers a number of islands. They annex Jamaica from the Spanish, they colonize the Bahamas. And in Canada, there are a few scattered settlements as well. However, compared to the Spanish and Portuguese empires of the previous centuries, they weren't extensive empires. They were scattered and disparate. They were also classified and notable because of the massacres that took place. Compared to the Spanish and Portuguese, although there was some violence, compared to what the British did in North America, it was quite peaceful. What happens by British settlers, of course, driven by that religious fervor, is hundreds of thousands of Indians are killed throughout. I say Indians, we spoke about the etymology of that term. We call them Native Americans now. Hundreds of thousands killed throughout the 17th century. And that means that, again, there needs to be a workforce to replace those people to make these settlements work. And it is throughout the 18th century, as the British and the French both transport large amounts of slaves, that the economy is stimulated and these territories grow from these disparate little settlements in the 17th century to huge areas of land that are comparable to Spain and Portugal. And it is in the 18th century when France and Britain really begin to rival the traditional colonial powers. If you look at the 13 colonies that were originally established along the northeast starboard of America by the British, you can see how much the picture has changed compared to the 17th century. The dark purpley red colour on the right is British controlled, the lighter pink is areas controlled by natives, and the blue is controlled by the French. So you can see that Britain has managed to gain more territory, although the province of Quebec and Montreal are important colonies for the French as well. And what happens in the mid 18th century, you start to see nations going to war with each other for new reasons. Traditionally, it had been over religious matters. Now you're seeing countries going to war over imperial and colonial territories. And the Seven Years' War is a turning point in both the relationship between Britain and colonists and the colonized, as well as other countries. And I'd like you to have a look at the Seven Years' War before the seminar because I'm going to be asking you about it in detail. But it's not just the Atlantic world that changes in the 18th century. The numbers of slaves that are being transported across the Atlantic, which are almost 10 million in number, completely revolutionized the economy of the British and the French. And it means that they can fund much more extensive and much more ambitious trade companies to take over the world. And this is where we're going to look outside of the Atlantic to give a little bit of extra context. And I'll show you how far the influence the British had in the 18th century, which is all made possible by their engagement in the slave trade. Um, Throughout the 18th century, Britain starts to expand its control over India. And that is made possible because the money that is made from slavery in the Atlantic, they can put into putting defenses in India. And what happens, the East India Company utilizes the divisions between local princes and they offer local princes money and jobs and soldiers. And in exchange, they can establish factories in India. They can start to trade without taxes. And slowly, throughout the 18th century, the East India Company becomes the dominant force in India, more powerful than the Mughal emperors of the time or even the British government. And Britain manages to drive the Dutch and the French out of India in this time period as well. And India, with its reserves of food, natural resources, and opium, allow Britain to continue colonial expansion. So without the Atlantic slave trade, Britain don't conquer Northeast America. Without Northeast America, you don't get as strong a presence in India as we see. And in the 18th century, it's not just the political conquering of countries. Britain began what is known as a cultural genocide in India. They start making changes to judicial systems, education systems, tax systems. And in 1793, in the Permanent Settlement Act, Britain actually establishes white rulers and they become the governors of India as well. So it is the genuine belief that Britain has a superior culture, and that is derived from racialized tensions we see from the early settlers. As a result of success in at the Atlantic, then America and India, Britain is able to expand its territories into Oceania as well. And it's in the second half of the 18th century, you get the voyages of James Cook, who travels all the way across the African coast, past South Africa, and eventually accesses the Cook Islands, New Zealand, and Australia. And it is through the diaries of Joseph Banks and Cook that we see attitudes towards native speakers intensifying, and becoming even more racist than previously we've seen. I've got a few quotes below us, and even though they accept the local Maoris as intelligent, you can see that the British believe they are better than them. So you can see Britain's influence slowly reaching throughout the entire globe. And this is true in Southeast Asia as well. And traditionally, the European countries had um, been dependent on the Silk Roads and the spices of Southeast Asia. And all of a sudden, in the mid 1770s, you get the British starting to rule those countries. And again, it's through economic invasions. An important individual who we'll talk about in the seminar is Captain Francis Light. And he is one of many very rich businessmen from Britain who see an opportunity in these new economic systems that are forming as a result of the slave trade. And he, Francis Light, actually ends up moving to Malaysia, and through a series of kind of economic transactions and savvy political moves, he is able to become the superintendent of Penang Island, and he actually renames it the Prince of Wales Island. So you can see again an example of British colonial powers um, changing culture and dominating other countries. And if we look at Southeast Asia as a whole by the end of the 18th century, you can see that Britain, France, and the Dutch have all taken control of the Southeast Asian islands and the lucrative products and spices and luxury items that come from these countries. And in another indication of what Britain is able to do logistically, as well as the moral implications of it, by the end of the 18th century, Britain is transporting its criminals from Britain to help colonize other islands. And there are a lot of parallels between the attitude towards transporting slaves in the Atlantic and criminals from Britain. They're almost seen as one and the same. And the first fleet that is sent to Australasia is in 1787. They get there in 1788. And the criminals they send there, they cannot control because of how far they are away. And the criminals that are sent to Australia end up fighting wars with the indigenous people, causing untold damage and destruction. And like what we see in America, the indigenous population of Australia is decimated. Within the first few decades of the Australians meeting the British, 20,000 Aboriginals are killed. Um, their customs, their religions are mocked and desecrated. And once again, disease destroys the population. So Britain is literally spreading diseases, but also acting like a disease, spreading throughout the world. So all of that the global powers we see in the 18th century and how far they can spread is all made possible because of the interaction of the slave trade, which basically acts like the engine of empire. So I put the main points that I want you to take away from this lecture on this slide. So if you take anything away from this, these are the main points. Now, for the seminar this week, I want you to read Sylvia Marzagali's article, The French, Atlantic, and the Dutch. late 17th to late 18th century. And that's going to give you an indication of how the French and Dutch behave. I've spoken mainly about the British, but this will give you an idea of how other imperial powers conducted themselves in this time period. There's two videos I've put on Moodle for you to watch as well, and we'll be discussing. I've also included a collection of primary sources um, from the National Archives. And you should go and have a look at a couple of those because, as I did last week, I'm going to send you away and have a look at some primary sources. So it'll be useful if you've already seen one or two of them. And the main question I want you to think about ahead of the seminar next week is what role did the Atlantic slave trade play in the development of European colonial empires throughout the rest of the world? Thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking about this next week.